Hello everybody, now this is the 6th anniversary of me living in Ukraine and the Ukrainian Revolution, Euromaidan. In this video I'm going to explain to you who planned and caused this revolution. So, obviously, the title of this video is Who Started Euromaidan? So Euromaidan had an enormous consequence for Ukraine itself and had an enormous impact on world politics, had iconic consequences for Europe, Russia, and the United States as well. So who really did it? Who done it? You know, that the all-important question. Who created it? Who orchestrated it? Who masterminded it? So I'm going to divide this video into 4 categories. Number 1, why Maidan was inevitable. Number 2, who really started it. And number 3, what happened behind the scenes. And number 4, the aftermath. So let's start with number 1, why the Maidan was inevitable. Well, there's a lot of conspiracy theories circling around the subject, right? They say something about Americans. You know, the Americans created everything. And then there's other people say something about the Russians. The Russian created everything. And number 3, the Soros has created it and his network of people. And it's the Illuminati and whatnot. In the end, it's really none of these, right? It's not so simple to really understand all of these things that really contributed to the creation of Maidan in the end and the consequences of Maidan, because you would have to realize that this sort of revolution at this point in time, with all these factors, could have only happened in Ukraine. And in order to understand that, you would have to realize what was happening in Ukraine before 2013. Under the rule of Yanukovych between 2010 until 2014, when he was obviously removed from power. And I've done a video of that already. So I don't want to go back into the history too much, but if you ever ask anybody what happened in 2004 in Ukraine, I think I was 18 back then. I was like really kind of proud that Ukraine was in the press, it was in the news, it was kind of like, wow, it's pretty cool. But Ukraine did already have a clash between Russia back then. And it was a basic clash of who should be the president, right? Either a Ukrainian-backed, I mean, it's very simplistic, but either a Ukrainian-backed or a Russian-backed candidate. So Ukraine already had a revolution. They had the experience. They knew what would get, like, they knew kind of like what to expect from the government and what lines the government should not cross, and that was a big one. And I guess the most important thing is that they already knew that their voices will be heard once they do specific things, take specific steps. So let's fast forward from 2004 back to 2012 when I first came to Ukraine. And I want to tell you a little bit about what I saw in Ukraine through my own eyes. And even though I was not part of this divide, I witnessed a massive divide between the top and the bottom of society. I mean, what really struck me as really strange was the way regular people were joking about the politicians at the top. And that time it was like Azarov, Yanukovych, like other like oligarchs all around that. And it was kind of scary, in my opinion. They were saying things like, oh, they abduct people, using those words, any sort of, apprehension or any sort of disgust, like it was normal, right? That's how it is, right? It was this mentality of us versus them. It's like we're in this little, square, and they're over there in a different little square. We're different, but we have to coexist. And this is how it should be, right? Well, obviously not everybody said this is how it should be, but this is like, they felt powerless to do anything about that, right? And what's worse is the people in that square, the elite, they took whatever they wanted, they did whatever they wanted, and they had absolutely there's no consequences for their actions whatsoever. And it came to the point that it would be impossible to get into a car and run into a cop without having to pay him for like a bribe or something. And that kind of stuff was just like the tip of the iceberg. In 2013, just so you know, it was very obvious. The Ukrainian government, the Yanukovych government, began to feel more and more emboldened to scare the average person. And not just the average person, but the whole groups of people that they deemed to be their enemies. It was like a journalist is their enemy. This is like they had a war against journalism. But you could have gotten beaten up with thugs, you could have gotten killed, you could have gotten abducted, and then it actually did happen to a number of journalists out there. So as you can see, when the government started declaring war on certain individuals and groups of people, um, it meant that anybody who was inconvenient for the government could be killed off, and that's how these things were handled, and that's how things were done. And again, the crucial part is that people began to accept it as normal. That was like the tipping point, where that's how it's going to be from now on, and there's nothing we can do about it. And that was a tipping point because, I mean, that was the start when resentment actually started getting built up, right? Resentment's built up, and without this resentment, there could be no protest, right? In theory. So let's move on to the next point and see who really started this movement. Again, you hear many people say different things, right? Some people say, "Oh yeah, America did it. America did it." But if you actually take a look at what happened, what America was doing with Yanukovych back in 2013, I think it was Chevron, or I think it was I'm not sure who it was. I think it was Chevron. Correct me if I'm wrong. They signed a deal with Yanukovych to explore shale gas reserves that Ukraine had. I think it was around it was like dozens of billions of dollars, maybe like $10 billion. I don't know, but it was a huge deal, and America had no interest in overthrowing Yanukovych whatsoever. I mean, yeah, they didn't really like some of his policies. They didn't really like the fact that he moved towards Russia, but that was more of a problem that was a problem that pressed Europe more than the United States. And the United States got what they wanted. They've gotten like a huge amount of a huge chunk of natural resources in Ukraine, and maybe that's just a start. Maybe they could have gotten more. So they really didn't have a reason to not to disrupt the status quo as it was. But then what happened was the European Association came into the picture, right? Europe and Ukraine was working towards the European Association Agreement for 3 years, right? And Russia knew this, but they were like kind of biding the time, and they needed to present their alternative, which was a customs union. The customs union is what they thought that they have the cat in the bag. They have Yanukovych. He's our buddy. He's kind of probably gonna have to do something there. But like we have our customs union. We have our own free trade agreement with all these post-Soviet countries here, and it's going to be a little rocky, but we're going to handle it. I think that's what Russia thought, and there was no reason to rock the boat because everybody was happy, and everything was okay. But that's where the but is. The but is the resentment, right? The resentment is the people that ended up going onto the Maidan. It was a dozen people, there were students, and everybody all around them knew that this little group of students, they're just gonna come out there, they're gonna like make some noise, and it will all end in nothing. They're all gonna go home and go to bed and wake up the next morning and go to work. Because again, this wasn't the first time that somebody gathered on the Maidan. It was like there were hundreds of these protests, and they're all just ended up just the same way that they started, right? But then there was this crazy event. For some very strange reason, Yanukovych instructed, or maybe worked in tandem with the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and on November 30th, it was around 4 a.m., where the Ministry of Internal Affairs with Berkut is a riot police. That back then it was a top police that there was, but they really went down on them. They came hard on them. They started like beating them half to death, like no tomorrow, shattering their bones, breaking their legs. Like people were terrified, and in some cases, the ones that got away, they were worse off because they ended up getting beat up by remember I talked about the thugs and stuff in my previous video. Well, there's these thugs that actually just went down there, and there were like over 5,000 instances of these attacks in that time. 5,000, that was like, that happened over months and months and months, right? But that was later, and that's what the government used against these people. So again, let's go back a little bit and ask ourselves this question. So why was this done? I mean, who would give such an order to cripple these young, students, teenagers, right? So that's an important question, because that event actually changes everything. The next day, right? Like, by some estimates, it's between 500,000 to a million people actually went out. This is like a good third, or like a quarter of entire population of Kiev. These people went out into the street, and because it was the last straw of lawlessness, who's gonna, why is this happening? Why is this happening? Why, like, this is like, we have nothing to lose, because we're living in this kind of in a place where, just kids are getting beaten to death. What did the Yanukovych government do? They went like even deeper into the hole. Again, instead of investigating, like, why did these riot police attack? Why did they do that? Again, instead of investigating these individual acts of violence, they ended up giving awards to these policemen. Can you believe that? Like, that's just like adding massive fuel to the fire. And I don't really understand to this day, and I don't think anybody does, why this actually happened. And let's also take a step back. I think I'm unfairly just talking about Yanukovych here, because he's not the only person here. I mean, I think if you think about it, like, there were arguably 3 or 4 like extremely powerful, influential men in Ukraine at the time, and one of them was Yanukovych, obviously, with his clan, with his grasp of the government and his inner circle. Then there was Firtash, and then there was Akhmetov. And there was another guy who was working between, I think, Firtash and Akhmetov. I'm not too sure, but his name was Lyovochkin. And he was the head of the presidential administration of Yanukovych, but essentially he was in opposition. He was more with the other 2 guys. So Lyovochkin and Akhmetov, I think it belonged to Firtash back then. They had their own most popular 40% of market share of viewership in Ukraine. It has a great, extremely popular TV channel called Inter TV, and this is the largest network. So, in full, he was showing on his channel the protests, the beatings, and it was broadcast, like I said, into every single corner of every home of every Ukrainian. So basically, everybody has seen it. And again, why did Lyovochkin do this? I mean, he really sought to sow discord and provoke people into coming out, right? Because he wanted more power, and he was in the opposition, and obviously, like, he used his resources into doing that. However, Lyovochkin, he really did make one critical error, right? He didn't take into account that these people were already so outraged that it was too late to present an opposition to them. They wanted a new life. And like everybody's all around the world is like looking at this, and the Americans are thinking, they're like, oh, let me grab my popcorn, this is gonna be fun. Let me stand back and take a look at it. But then as they realized how serious it was, they realized, okay, wait a second, we want to be in part of this. We want in on the action, Firtash, the guy that I just mentioned, well, FBI was preparing a case for him. They prepared a case for him really fast because they saw Yanukovych was unreliable. They wanted a little bit of insurance policy of what they could do, again, in case of something went like in a different direction for them, right? And the Russians are also like looking at all this. They're thinking, oh, let's see, what are we gonna do here? Well, they've invested a lot in Ukraine already, and they can't just sit back and like watch the, let's say, investment, go down the tubes. So they're like, okay, wait a second, let's see what we can do here. Look, we want Crimea, right? They have been planning to take Crimea for a while, so we can take it. Oh, and then we can declare Ukraine as a coup, and voila, just this perfect moment of clarity, sort of like reaches Russia, and they decide to do this. Let's paint all the people at the Maidan revolution radicals. I mean, okay, maybe there were, to be honest, in all honesty, there was maybe like 1% of the people were radicals, and then Russia was like, nope, they're all radicals, they're all horrible, they created a coup, the government is illegitimate, we take Crimea, we start back in the existing president, and that's it. And and that was like the only way to drive the wedge really deep into the society of Ukraine, a country that's not really even unified at this point, and it's practically falling apart, right? The consequence of that was the deaths. Yeah, more than 100 people killed, and yeah, some of the law enforcement officials from the Berkut riot police were killed as well, and yeah, people shooting at each other. And again, to this day, nobody's gonna know who shot who, and maybe even some of the Russian intelligence officers over there, they got shot in the process. He's the only beneficiary of the situation is Putin, because without Maidan there would be no Crimea. And the ironic part is that Putin is terrified of the Maidan. He's terrified of it at home because he knows what would happen if it actually materializes in Russia. So the ironic part of Putin is that he benefited so much from Maidan, but he keeps saying that Maidan is horrible, and he simply cannot allow it to happen in Russia because he's simply terrified of any sort of unrest it would bring him, and he's terrified of how it can undermine his power vertical. And obviously he's just afraid that Americans are going to use this on him, and then just as the way he used it in Ukraine. So what happened behind the scenes? Let's take a look at what happened behind the scenes. So imagine this picture. So like I was told this version of events as well myself. So imagine that Yanukovych is panicking in his office. He hasn't slept for 3 days, and he's counseling his advisors like what to do, like day and night, like what to do. And then Putin keeps calling him on the phone and telling him, Yanukovych, you gotta use force, you gotta kill those bastards, you gotta, use rats, just get rid of them, right? And if you're thinking, well, it kind of makes sense, well, guess what? You're not too far off. Because Putin, in theory, right, if he did not provoke Yanukovych to violence, there would be no violence, right? More to the point, I guess, consider that the Berkut riot police, the commander, right, who was actually there, who personally led the beating of students on November 30th, he obviously managed the Berkut office in Kiev. He now works for the riot police in Moscow, right, as chief. So, I mean, why is that? Because obviously he had some help from Russia, or he was influenced by Russia. And again, why didn't he go become a police chief somewhere else? Because he had ties to Russia. Why did he become a riot police head in Beijing or Los Angeles or somewhere else? Well, the reality is, I think this is further proof that the violence was attacked by Russia through Yanukovych in Ukraine, right? So I believe that this whole America did this, or Soros did that, or Russia did that, it's kind of like a big load of BS. If you can get one thing out of what I'm saying, is that forget all the conspiracy theories and realize that everyone took part in it. Whether it's good or bad, it doesn't really matter. It's impossible to judge who and what did this. The reality is that the Maidan was inevitable because the protests were inevitable, because Yanukovych chose to play Assad or Gaddafi, on the European continent, right next door to the civilized world. And if anything can be learned from this, it's one thing. If 100 people go out onto the square, they might be dispersed. But if 1 million people go out on the square, they're not going to go anywhere. And of course, Yanukovych has practically done everything possible to set people against him. He made the mortal enemy out of everybody, like, who's honest, the honest police officer, the honest journalist, the investigative reporter. Anybody who might start investigating this rotten core, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the Supreme Court, and whatnot. So when people start doing that, and in retaliation you make them your enemy, you burn down their cars, you kidnap them, you beat them up, that's not going to play well over long term, right? And if that's how you play your game, eventually, if you treat people like they don't exist, if you treat people like dirt, then sooner or later these people are going to act as though you don't exist, and they're going to see you as illegitimate. And that is exactly what happened with Yanukovych, and that's exactly why the Maidan was not avoidable. And anyway, in the next video, I'm going to explain the differences in Ukraine before 2014 and after 2014. And hit like and subscribe if you like it, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, guys.